Really awesome that you got it to compile onto the Switch. As a Nintendo employee working on the OS networking team, that likely took quite a lot of effort to accomplish. Thanks. I did not do any of that work personally. Ignacio did that. I don't know how much work it was, but I am glad that we have done it. We are definitely leaning on LLVM a lot for that functionality, right? So LLVM is generating the actual code. I am not sure what else had to happen to make it happen on the Switch. There were definitely some assumptions internal to the compiler. Oh, it's worth pointing out, by the way, that the Nintendo Switch is an ARM device, right? So it's not just running on a console, it's running on a console with a different instruction set entirely. Didn't someone have a GDC talk about it? About what? I can't tell what you're asking from context. Will closed beta be first come, first served, or invite only? It's going to start as a small invite only beta, and then we will grow it over time. The goal being just, if there are some basic problems or bugs that people run into, we don't want to waste a lot of people's time. And we also want to spend high quality attention on the feedback that we're getting. And if we get just tons of feedback from everybody on the internet, it's hard to give high quality attention to that, right? So we only want to do that once we're a little bit further along. How will macros differ from C? We will certainly give an entire demo about that, but in short, they're a little bit more like macros from Lisp or Scheme. Not exactly, but they're hygienic macros and they're structured. They're not text substitution. Am I still running with no jobs? No jobs is just an option. I'm not sure what you mean by that. There's two things you could mean by that. No jobs is a debug option that we use when debugging in order to keep things deterministic so that we can just reproduce the same scenario over and over to debug something, right? So no, we don't run with that option generally. If you mean, is the rest of the compiler threaded? The answer is not yet. Portions of the compiler are threaded, but the majority of it by runtime is not. So our performance numbers, you know, it compiles pretty fast, right? It compiles that game in a little under 1 second. Full build, no incremental anything. That's mostly single core performance to do that in 1 second, and that'll improve as we thread things. And B, it's actually, you know, I did some things to the compiler that make it slower than it should be and haven't gotten around to making it faster again. So I think we should be able to get back down to like 0.8 or 0.7 seconds. Also, a substantial piece of that is the linker, and Visual Studio announced a thing where like their linker is going to be faster for some reason. So we'll see if that helps. How does the pipe dependency system work? Can you make a video showing how the compiler works internally? Actually, I think I discussed that. Let's look at I saw it go by here. This one, if you go on YouTube to this playlist, number 19, this demo code modification, talks about the pipeline system in some ways. It maybe doesn't talk about the dependencies exactly, but it goes into some detail talking about how code flows through the compiler. That's what this block diagram is that you could see here. Is cross compilation with Switch only with LLVM currently, or do you have a new backend? It's only with LLVM currently. What are your ideas for memory management? Rust borrow check is actually very useful and makes you wonder what other rocks can be turned over to make manual memory management safe. Well, I mean, the thing about borrow checking, so here's the thing. Actually, let me first find another YouTube video that I can refer you to that's not about Rust. You may have seen this. Many of you out there may have seen this. I gave this talk at a conference called Game Lab in Barcelona. And So about a year ago, a little more than a year ago, and it talks about why some decisions were made the way they were and so forth. And at the beginning of this speech, I talk about why certain mental models of memory make your program slow. I was mostly focusing on things like RAII, which is the C++ idea of how you're supposed to clean up your memory, and that's inherently slow. It's very slow in modern programs, and the reason is not about what instructions are generated exactly. It's about the fact that thinking about your program that way makes you treat everything in your program as a tiny separate thing. But the way that you make programs fast is by batch operating on large numbers of things. This is something that Mike Acton says all the time too, right? So if your mental model of everything is that it's a tiny separate thing, your program's going to be slow. So now the thing about Rust is the ownership and borrow checking model, even though it's not like RAII in that it doesn't necessarily encourage heap allocating everything all the time, although it can do that, it does encourage you thinking about all those things as tiny separate things because that's how they're being tracked, okay? And so I'm wary of that. I don't think it leads to writing fast programs. That said, there was that entity component system in Rust talk a while ago, which was sort of about, in my opinion, overriding the borrow checker because it was too much of a pain in the butt by giving it flat arrays that it doesn't know are separately allocated bits of memory. Now, that is an architecture that is a lot faster than a lot of other things. But I'm not sure that it speaks well of the borrow checker, that it forces people or encourages them to work around it, right? Now, that said, I think there's some contention in the Rust community that's whether that's really what's happening or not, but I think if you look at it objectively, that's really what's happening in that case. As usual, though, let me say, I don't mean to bag on Rust too hard. I think it's a very good idea to try and make a language, well, not just try, but to make a language with that level of static analysis, because we definitely need people who are working on making software more robust and more analyzable and more just more manipulatable, like a solid object instead of a super fragile thing that's going to fall apart anytime you touch it. And so I'm in favor of Rust. Like, I like that they're making it. It's not exactly the language for me, but it's definitely research that needs to happen. Public beta estimated before 2020. I'm not sure about public beta. Private beta definitely before 2020. Public beta depends on how well private beta goes. We just have to see. Do we also have a module for network stuff like simple TCP sockets? I don't know. Probably not. Maybe not. But I definitely have something like that in the witness that I could port over. We probably should have a network demo program. Maybe it would be fun for me to do that at some point. Do I feel like it's holding well to the original principles? 80% solutions, not a big idea language. Definitely. Definitely. And I think, for example, the removal of constructors that we just did falls into that category. It was like, we were just like, look, this isn't really serving the practical purpose that I wanted it to. If we go, I also didn't want to go down the C++ road of having constructors be invasive through the whole language and having everything be massively complicated. Because the thing is, all of these weird features that C++ has, like all the different LX, WR value, PDQ value stuff, and move versus copy and all that is because of constructors and because of the way they did operator overloading. Those two things put together generates all that complication. And it's not just that it makes the language complicated, but it has real performance impacts. So for example, if you have an array like a standard vector or something that that is trying to play well with a constructor-destructor system, you can't put things into uninitialized memory in the array unless you explicitly tag it as a move into uninitialized memory, which complicates your user code, because the thing that you're writing over, if it's a copy, has to get destructed, and it can't be destructed if it's uninitialized memory because it'll crash your program. Like, it just gets, the amount of complication that you have to think about just to do something simple like put something into an array gets bananas. And so we wanted to avoid that, and the way that we're avoiding it by now is by just not doing any of it. Do you have concrete plans for handling pointer aliasing? Well, we don't really have nearly as many raw pointers here as you do in C, C++. And the pointers that we have are usually associated with higher level things that we may be able to have some more coherent aliasing rules about. I'm not sure. We haven't thought about it too seriously, but we're going to start thinking about it soon. With the removal of the CRT, how do you implement math functionality like sine, cosine? Are you going to make a custom implementation for the compiler? Well, if you just want a couple of math routines like sine and cosine, it's actually not that much code. There are some really old libraries that have been around forever that have ports into many languages, and we can just borrow those. Although for sine and cosine, I think my opinion is like, look, I'm pretty sure all modern CPUs have bit accurate intrinsics for sine and cosine. So like, let's just not pretend they don't and make it an intrinsic. We haven't done that yet, but in my opinion, that is maybe what we should do. However, haven't thought about it too seriously yet. How many people are actively working on the language? There's about 4 people doing some mixture of language stuff and game stuff and demo program stuff. Is 0 initialized still the default? Yes, it is currently. When you make a declaration in this language, it is initialized to 0, or it's, you know, if it's a struct with default values, it gets initialized to those, unless you say that it should be uninitialized. I'm not completely sure that that's the right solution, actually, in terms of making your program error-free, but it's definitely the tersest program. Like, the great majority of the time, you want things to be 0. So, yeah. Demo at Handmade Seattle. I don't know yet if I will be there. I need to figure it out. How close will that beta be? Well, it'll start very small, and then it'll grow, like I said. Can it run in all platforms? So right now, the compiler works on, well, broadly right now speaking, it works on Windows, Linux, and Mac as your host platforms. However, I probably broke Mac this past week with some stuff that I did, so we have to fix that. But like, it basically works on those platforms. Will this video be on YouTube? Yes, unless a disaster happens. Any handmade debugger developers contact me to work on support for this language? No, I wouldn't expect anyone to until it's a language used by anybody who doesn't work at our company, right? Like, this language is literally used by 4 people on the planet Earth right now. So, you know, until that widens up, I wouldn't expect anyone out in the world to like try and do tool support, because it wouldn't make sense. Why did I decide on implementing macros in the language rather than using the pre-existing metaprogramming functionality? Are the macros semantic or one step about textual? Again, I'd prefer not to go into too many details about the macro system, just because we're going to do that in the macro demo. Why do them rather than using the metaprogramming functionality? Because Well, my policy on these things is as follows. I certainly don't mind building a custom implementation in order to determine what something should be, and then seeing if we could do that in a metaprogram. And if we can, then let's move it to the metaprogram and keep the core of the compiler simple. However, I think often with heavily integrated things, or with features that are going to be used heavily, let's say, it's better to have them integrated into the compiler because the compiler knows what that is and can give you a good error message, or can just handle it quickly, right? And then the other thing about the metaprogramming system is that often, so for the kind of metaprogramming that you would do to expand macros manually, you usually operate on that with some other procedure, and that other procedure that's operating on it is like not located in the same place. It's far away. And so if you're going to substitute a certain macro for some other thing, the place at which that's happening is far away from the thing, and that's not necessarily good for program understanding. Although, honestly, we haven't done that much of it yet. And then the last thing to say about that is that the way that we're doing macros actually will be more integrated with the current metaprogramming system than it might sound like, and I'll show during the demo what that means. That part of it actually is not implemented yet, and so it's a thing we got to go do. What is my approach for marketing the language going to be? I'm not that worried about that. Like, there's way too many people in the world who are trying to get you to use their thing, right? Definitely that's a practical concern. I think I would like people to use this language, but it's more important that it be good. So, because that's really what we need. We're in a place with computers right now where there's just way too many people getting you to use their stupid JavaScript framework of the week that doesn't actually do anything, right? Like, all of JavaScript doesn't actually do anything. So if we're going to start there. So we're just in a bad place. There's too many people doing that. We need people doing something different than that. And so that's part of the motivation for this. How mature is the language currently, in my opinion? I don't know how to answer. That's a very vague sounding question. I don't know of any maturity scale from 1 to 10 or anything that I could like say. Am I sticking with the idea of putting all source on library imports? Would that shift the culture to distributing source instead of distributing or just use compiled binaries? Yes. So yes, the idea is unless you have a proprietary library, it's always going to have source there rather than you linking to things. The linking against binaries model causes a lot of problems, a huge number of problems, and it reduces your power. So for example, because you're compiling the library from source every time, your metaprogram can just grab one of its functions and change it. You can't do that if it's compiled into a .lib. So it's very powerful. AOS feature is no longer in the language, right? How do you feel about the language's ability to provide support around that? Yeah, it's not in there. I deleted the code for it the other day, actually. But the plan is to provide something for that. It's just, it's not as important as everybody thinks it is. Like, yes, you want something to help with that, but well, we'll see. We'll see. It's definitely going to be there. We're going to do something good to support it. It just will not necessarily look like the thing that we demoed. Let me put it that way. It'll be better than the thing that we demoed, hopefully. Can I briefly explain again why constructor and destructors were cut? No, I feel like I said enough that I can about that. Is there some kind of replacement for it? Yeah, defer. Will the closed beta be people you know personally? No, it won't just be people I know personally, but I have a backlog of people who have emailed requesting to be in the beta, and I will contact some number of them and say, hey, do you still want to do this? And we'll grow it that way. Did I make my own linker now? No. What was the feature in the compiler that took up most of the time? Out of order compilation is by far the most time consuming complicated thing. If we just had header files like C, we would go twice as fast. It would be crazy. I mean, not compile twice as fast. We'd compile slower, actually, but we would be able to develop the compiler much, much faster. Has memory profiling become easier or more involved with your current approach of not having constructors, destructors? I think those things are orthogonal. I don't think, like, we definitely want to do some more work in making memory profiling easier and more natural, but I don't think that that has much to do with constructors. Part of that is because even from the very beginning, we were careful to separate memory allocation from actual initialization, which C++ doesn't do. Like, it provides facilities later, like you can new into existing memory or something, but like new in C++ conflates initialization with allocation, and we were careful not to do that. Are we generating LLVM IR and feeding that in, or manually feeding the parts of the program to the LLVM library? We're like manually feeding it. If you generate the IR yourself, like in text, it's a disaster because LLVM is not very good at handling things that it doesn't expect in textual IR. Like, I tried that actually initially, and it was, oh my God. It was undebuggable. It was insane. Do you have anything planned for audio synthesis in the audio module? Not currently. That's probably for other people to do. How does this compare to C or C++ for performance critical apps? It should be as fast or faster. We'll see if we can deliver that. How much interest is this from other game developers? Lots of people are interested. I hear from people who are interested in it all the time. Our structured notes on the roadmap, maybe. Like, those are something where it'll probably be an improvement to do that, but it just hasn't been that important. So we just keep putting it off. I think we should do it, though, probably. The language is intended to get a screen on any operating system, or do I misunderstand this? I don't know what that means. Get a screen on any operating system. I don't understand your question. Do you think this language could ever be applied to making the web a sane place to develop? I think we need to burn the web down and start over. So I don't think that necessarily has much to do with which programming language you use to do that with. Because the fundamental mistakes of the web are deeper than that. How much of the game development process do I think will be sped up for most teams? I can't. You want me to give a number? Like what? I don't know. It's definitely, for me, it's definitely faster. It's nicer. I enjoy myself more. I write less code. I write better code. So how much of an impact does that have? Well, it could be very large or it could be very small depending on what you're programming and how complicated it is and how much you're dealing with sort of the network effects of complicated things interacting with other complicated things. I'm going to start ignoring redundant questions at some point. There's just so many questions here. Are there portability issues with the intrinsic system? Not really. If you use an intrinsic that's not supported on the target platform, that's just an error. Someone doesn't know what is meant by defer, you can look at that YouTube playlist. There is a demo there of defer. Will we closed beta participants be able to stream, make videos? Yeah. I don't have any desire to put too much secrecy on the beta. Is the module system similar to the approach of any other language? We'll just talk about that. Don't ask me about stuff that we're going to demo, because we'll demo it when we demo it. We'll demo it when we demo it. How many lines to get pixels on the screen? Well, unfortunately, I mean, if you count total lines of code, it's as many as for anything else, because we can't, if operating systems make it hard to put pixels on the screen, we can't do anything about it. We can give you a module that hopefully does most of that for you, but it still has to happen. Do we think we'll end up writing an ARM backend or just leave it with LLVM? It'll just be LLVM for now. Long term, I can't really speculate on that. We just have to see how it goes. Can we at some point show the tricks like atoms, et cetera, that made the compiler so incredibly fast? It's not really tricks. We don't do any big tricks to make the compiler fast. It is literally just writing code that is not super slow. Compiler is not even that fast. We haven't worked very much at optimizing it. It's just not slow. And so this is, like, I was on Twitter yesterday and I said, most programmers think computers are orders of magnitude slower than they really are. And I got pushback from like people who were like, oh, that's nonsense. And it's like, but no, it's really true. Like, this is compiling a 100,000 line program shouldn't take more than a second. Like, in fact, we do some stuff that's pretty slow actually, and we still can do it in a second. So what's wrong with everybody else? I don't know, guys. It's just software is in a really, like, I don't know how else to say it. I can just say software is in a very bad state today, okay? The way people program and the things that they program are all very misguided. And we would benefit a great deal if we fix it in some way. I don't know how to fix it when so many people have so many misconceptions, but yeah. We are not doing anything fancy to compile a 100,000 line program in 1 second. We're really not. There are C compilers that are much faster than that, actually. We're slower because we have to do stuff like, function overloading and whatever. It's very hard for a new language to succeed. What are the 2 key features that you think will do? There aren't 2 key features. Dude, just watch the YouTube demos. Sorry. I don't feel like it's my job to convince. I'm not going to go beg people to use this programming language. It's like, look, I'm going to make it the best thing to use for many applications, and then smart people will use it. The end. That's how it's going to go. How painful would I say the learning curve is? I'm not the right person to judge. I don't think it's that bad. That said, we haven't really written tutorials and stuff like that yet. So when people on the team had to learn how to use it, they just kind of had to watch the videos and look at the example programs. So we'll have something better than that, where we explain step by step how to go from a small program to a bigger one. But we haven't written that stuff yet. Chucklefish gave up on Rust. They focus on C++ now. Huh. Interesting. Did they say why? Did they make a video why? Or did they just kind of keep it under wraps? Why? Because they seemed very positive on Rust for a little bit. What about type safety? What is the attitude towards the plethora of proven useful type features being used in many languages now? See, you're saying proven, comma, useful as if it's a no-brainer to adopt these features. I don't agree. I don't agree. Look, the things that we've demoed are the things that I think are clearly net positives for the kind of application that we're doing. When you start talking about algebraic types and stuff, I'm like, no, that's not proven. Don't say it's proven. Can I do a rant about containerization sometime? I have done that several times. I just don't know where the clips are, if they exist. What do I think about games that aren't trying to push the boundary of performance? Surely the most important thing then would be ease of development and maintenance. Well, sure, but again, this is one of these misconceptions that's screwing up programming today. Everybody thinks like, oh, those low-level programming languages with manual memory allocation are complicated and hard, and the high-level languages are simple and the easiest to program in and maintain. I don't think that's true. Dude, JavaScript is a giant disaster minefield. It's actually really hard to program in. It's like probably easier to make hello world in JavaScript than in C, but once you get to a substantially complicated program, it's actually harder. It's way harder. Similarly with C++. It's way harder to manage a large, complicated C++ program than a large, complicated C program. And I don't think people have a clear understanding of this, all right? If you want ease of development and maintenance of a complicated program, you shouldn't be relying on magical memory things happening or, you know, magical high-level features that you don't know what they're doing, because it's that not knowing what those features are doing that will make you confused and make you make mistakes later on, right? Those are the things that prevent you from scaling up to a certain level of complexity in terms of delivered features. That's just how it is. And I wish that we would get clarity about that, right? Some languages do a better job than others. So I think, for example, C# probably, not if you use all the C# features, but if you use, let's say, a disciplined subset of C# features, it is probably better at being understandable and scaling to large, complex programs than C++ is, for example. On the other hand, though, you pay for that with the garbage collection, which is really unpleasant at some scale. So I don't know. But I just wish there's this misconception right now that the higher level the language, the easier it is to program in. And that is absolutely not true. Absolutely not true. Do we have plans to add immutable, non-alias strict pointers? We need to think about it. We need to look at what will be simple and deliver performance. Wow, there was another sine cosine question, so I assume that was asked a long time ago. Jeez, let me get down here. Will we open source the compiler? Eventually, but not initially. When we first beta, it'll be closed source, mainly because I don't want to deal with annoying open source politics, right? I just don't want any part of that. The open source community is embarrassing in some ways, and I just don't want anything to do with it. So we'll be closed source for a while. Eventually, we will open source it. Are you encouraged to pass everything by value and let the compiler decide if it should be a const ref? I mean, I know what you're asking, and yes, but it's like, it's not exactly by value, right? It's what looks like by value in C, right? This is sort of an interesting, weird thing, right? So in a language like C++, references and pointers are actually the same thing in terms of what they mean. It's just that there's slightly different higher level semantics associated with them. But it's like, it ends up being a really complicated, by the time you chase those down in terms of all their ramifications with all the C++ features, it's just a really overcomplicated way to manage what's essentially pointers, right? So we don't want to go down that road. We don't want to go down the road of like adding a reference type that you explicitly use. But there is definitely some stuff in the type system about like, oh, this is a parameter that was passed by value or const reference, and so therefore you can't modify it, right? So large parameters are immutable right now, and that sort of thing. And so there's a question of like, is there profit to be made by making that more formal in terms of the type system and being types that you can declare? Or is it just a specific thing that happens in a small set of cases, like parameters and iteration? And I'm not sure yet. So we might juggle that around. It has a lot to do also with, again, the aliasing question of what is going to help us produce the fastest code with the least amount of manual annotation on aliasing, but also the least amount of really obnoxious rules. Like the C++ casting rules about like, you can't cast a type to another type except through char star. Those are just unacceptable. I don't know what those people are smoking, so that is not going to be what it is. So we have to look at some alternative. Do we plan to have some sort of built-in game loop? We're going to give out a game engine. Will we come with a math module with types like matrices? Yes. Do you plan on supporting any architectures besides x86? We already do. You obviously missed the summary, the progress report. Are we going to make a package manager? Probably not. Not in the way that you're thinking. I don't like package manager culture exactly. Do I think compiler supplied vector structs with only basic operator overloads is a good idea? I mean, I haven't attacked the problem of how to provide fast vectorized math. I sort of feel like generic vectorized vector types can't go that far in terms of making your code really fast anyway. So like, I think if you want to write some math code that's fast, you just start using intrinsics probably. I don't know. Will there be vector types with swizzling, etc., like in shader languages? I think you could do that with macros right now. Maybe. I mean, the trick is, it's not that hard to do that. It's not that hard to do that to give you a value, but like a value or something you can assign to that's a swizzle probably needs further features to happen, but they're not that different. The version of SOA that we're going to do, if you think about the modified version of SOA as being more about just declaring what the layout of something is, then you could start to see how that could interact with swizzling, right? You find it amazing that you're watching this live in an underground train half a world away in Melbourne, but we still have crappy JavaScript libraries. Well, that is the world that we live in. Has Casey gotten to play with the language? No, he hasn't. I imagine he's too busy. He's making his own. He's making 2 games right now. What? Yeah, I'm gonna let Casey do his thing. I'm gonna let him make his 2 games. I don't. There's a few questions here about like how is versions of the language going to be managed post-release and stuff. I'm not going to worry about that right now. Like, my goal right now is to get to the closed beta. That's it. I'm not going to speculate about things after that because they might change anyway. Is it fair to say that the language encourages metaprogramming over putting complexity in the type system? Maybe. I mean, we have yet to see that play out. I don't know. Is there any plan for an IDE? No. You're generating LLVM IR for Odin. It's a nightmare. Are you emitting the bit code or just using the libraries? We're using the libraries. Josh wrote most or all of that, and it's several thousand lines of code. We probably actually have it, because it's one of the bigger files. Where was it in the slideshow when we do the line count? Yeah, it's the 3rd biggest file. It's 3,500 lines of code just to translate our internal representation to LLVMs. And it's pretty slow because the LLVM API is really slow. Like, I don't know how else to put it. It's a classic object-oriented way too, I want to say handsy. It's way too opinionated about how everything should be represented. And you just know that it's slow just by looking at the API documentation. It's also just really complicated for what it does. Like, dude, it's insane. From that standpoint, I would actually, if I had LLVM stock, I would short it long term because it's just too complicated for what it does. Like, short to medium term, I think it's a very good library. I'm glad it exists. It's providing functionality that we're able to use very well. But like, if you look at what it does versus how you have to talk to it, the how you have to talk to it part is crazy. And yeah. And it doesn't bode well for what the intern. Also, the fact that it takes an hour to compile also doesn't bode well for its long-term complexity. Will we provide a custom scalable allocator or rely on the system allocator? No, we will not rely on the system allocator because I think that's bananas. Like, if you're going to compile a program that uses a general heap allocator, you should know what the behavior of that allocator is. It shouldn't randomly change depending on which platform you compile your program on. So that is a thing that will be built in. We're only doing on-topic questions, not general Twitter rant questions. You remember one of the optimization streams where I avoided looking into time spent in a type checker because it was too complicated. Did I go back since then and find some nice type checker performance wins? No, haven't really spent that much time on optimization. However, every time we simplify the compiler in terms of base functionality, we make it more optimizable, because optimization usually adds complexity. When you simplify, you free up complexity budget that could be spent on optimization. You also make it easier to see opportunities for optimization because you make it easier to understand what the hell's going on. So we've made progress in that direction, just not like obvious progress. I'm getting hungry. I might need to go have a hamburger soon. Any plan to begin self-hosting? No, I don't. It's just not important right now. Eventually it will be. I think in the long term, being able to do a good multi-threaded version of the compiler probably requires it not being in C++, because C++ is bad at multi-threading. However, we're not much better at multi-threading than C++ yet. So that would not by itself be a reason to move the compiler off C++. We will be better at multi-threading. We just aren't yet. We're a little bit better, actually, because of the way modules work now, which is not yet disclosed, but we'll talk about that. For APIs in C or C++, do you think you could provide a tool to convert API headers? I think we might have a simple version of that, right? The problem is for complex code, you basically have to be a C++ compiler because it's so hard to parse C++. Like once you've got templates in there and stuff, it's crazy, right? So like maybe that has to be like a Clang plugin or something linked against libclang or something. I don't know. Will it be possible to implement a working edit and continue? Yeah, I mean, that's something that I wanted to put in the compiler from early days, and I just never got around to it because it's not that important because we compile really fast. But it would be nice to put in, yeah. How is the source code broken up into small pieces for the Lexer parser to be multi-threaded? We just do one file at a time right now, and any substantially sized program is probably going to have a number of files, including the modules that you import. So it's like the parallelism is a file level granularity. The parser just loads the text of the entire file at once and just cranks on it. Do I consider creating own internal representation? We already have one. How are binary sizes looking in general? I don't know. I haven't compared them against anything comparable right now. My sense is they're a little bigger than I would like, but I haven't looked at the reasons for that. But that's for big programs. Hello World is not going to be big. Like we don't add a big bloated runtime library. Like our runtime support library that I pointed out is like it's less than 300 lines. That's the thing that gets linked to everything, or not even linked is not the right word. That's what gets compiled into everything. There's actually another little bit in the preload. So no, Hello World is not going to be bloated, but I think the code that we generate maybe has more instructions than it should. Even, like I said during the talk, LLVM maybe generates more copies than we want and so forth. They had another game and wanted to use one engine for everything. Oh, that's the Chucklefish. That sounds short-sighted to me. That sounds like an excuse. If you were excited enough about the benefits of a new language, you would port everything to that new language. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I would have liked to use one language for everything with our old game engine, but that's just not what we're doing. So, yeah. Are there a lot of features from C++ that have been left out? Yes, most features from C++ have been left out. Will you add any struct procedure call syntax to the language? No. No. It's not nicer. I don't know why everybody thinks that's nicer. It's not nicer. It adds more complexity to do the same thing that you already could do. I don't recommend it. I don't recommend it. You've been told that web programming is so different than game programming that the knowledge is not transferable. You disagree with that, but are there principles of programming games you feel like should not be applied to the web? I don't think web programming is that different in principle. Like, I think programming is what it is. I think web programming has become very different because they're doing so many crazy, weird, broken things. I think if you took away most of the crazy, weird, broken things from web programming, it would look more like normal programming again. And then people wouldn't say web programming is so different from game programming, you know? So, yeah. Let's go back to the Q&A slide so people who show up. I'm getting hungry. We might have to finish the Qs soon. Do I think this language will be easier to pick up by someone who doesn't use any low-level languages? I don't know. Like, I can't answer questions about how easy or hard it is to pick up. We'll just see. A lot of that depends on the quality of introductory materials, which we don't have yet. Would this be applicable for image processing? Sure. Why not? Will the game engine we ship with the language support 2D games? We will have 2D example programs, like Blobman and the chess program, and maybe some other things. Will the game be open source? Yes. Do we support RAII? Not really. You could do it yourself with macros. I don't like RAII. I don't think it's the right way to program. I think it's a mistake. I understand why it sounds like the right thing, but it is not the right thing. Now we're getting troll proto-buff questions. I can't answer. I'm getting a lot of questions about beta participation. I can't answer those right now. Sorry, we've got to get to the end of the technical questions. Technical questions only. How stressful has the development of the compiler been compared to the stress of games I've worked on? That's not a technical question. I'll do it anyway, though. Less stressful. Definitely building the compiler has been easier than building games. Definitely. What debugging tools are we using? I just use Visual Studio to debug, even though I don't like it. Is there a grammar published? No. That's the end of the specially marked questions. Okay, I'm getting hungry. Thank you, everybody, for coming by. As I mentioned in our roadmap, we will have an actual demo soon and not just a summary. That'll be a feature demo. Okay, well, probably. If I scrape together enough features to do a good demo. If this happens, it'll be in about a week or possibly 2 weeks at most if I decide to program a couple more small features. So the plan is for that to be the next thing. And then the next demo after that is macro system. So we're going to just sort of kick into gear of doing a regular cadence of demos for a little bit. But after a while, maybe we just run out of demos to do, right? Because if we're close enough to the beta, we don't really have that many new features at some point. So that would be good news if we run out of demos to do. Thank you, everybody, for coming by. If you missed portions of this, it'll be posted on YouTube. I will tweet it later. In the meantime, thanks for coming by. And you can always drop me. Oh, well, let me put up the traditional email address. So this email address is where, is that above the camera? I think it is. Yeah. That email address, you can send me comments, questions. I don't reply to everything because sometimes there's just too much traffic or, I just need to focus on working. But yeah, drop me a line there if you have thoughts. I do read everything. I just don't reply to everything. It's not a mailing list. It's not a community discussion. It's just like a straight line, like place where I read what people think. I will tweet about the future demos before they happen, probably a few days in advance each time. And we have a Discord for Twitch subs if you want to get on there and be an elite Twitch Discord subscriber. Thank you, everybody, for coming by. And I'll see you later.